Welcome back to Allkids, everyone. Today we're going to be continuing in our series of Old Testament characters. Now, we're not going to be looking at every one from the Old Testament, but we are going to be talking about a select few that you might have heard of. So last week, we talked about Abraham. Now, Abraham had a son called Isaac, and Isaac had a son called Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons. And one of those sons is the person we're going to be talking about today, and that person is Joseph. So Joseph was Abraham's great-grandson. Now Jacob loved all of his 12 sons, but Joseph was his favorite. Now parents aren't meant to have favorites, but Jacob made it pretty clear that Joseph was his favorite. And his brothers were all jealous of him. They didn't like him very much because they all knew that he was their father's favorite. One day, while they were out tending their sheep, they saw Joseph coming in the distance, and they started planning to kill Joseph. They hated him that much. But Reuben, the eldest, he convinced his brothers not to kill Joseph, but just to throw him into a hole. And Reuben had planned to come back later and rescue Joseph. So when Joseph came up, they all attacked him, they grabbed him, and they threw him into a pit in the ground. A little while later, Reuben had gone off to tend the sheep, and some merchants came along the road heading towards Egypt. And the rest of the brothers, they got together and they said to each other, "Why don't we sell Joseph to these merchants? That way we can get rid of him. We'll probably never see him again, but we'll get some money for ourselves in return." So they pulled Joseph up out of the pit and they sold him to these merchants who were heading towards Egypt. Poor Joseph, right? Joseph was a slave in a foreign country, but God was with Joseph. And eventually he got promoted until he was in charge of the household of a very important person in Egypt. But something bad happened again. One day, Joseph was framed for a crime he didn't commit, and he was thrown in prison. But God was with him even then. You see, Joseph knew that God wouldn't forsake him. Joseph knew God wouldn't abandon him. 2 years went past that Joseph was in prison. But eventually, Pharaoh, who's like the king in Egypt, he had a very strange dream. Pharaoh wanted to know what that dream meant, so he called all the magicians of Egypt to come together to try and figure out what this dream was all about. But none of them could tell Pharaoh what his dream meant. Eventually, Pharaoh heard that God had given someone the power to interpret dreams. And this person was right there in Egypt. In fact, this person was in prison in Egypt, and his name was Joseph. So Pharaoh called Joseph to come up from the prison and to come to his courts, and he asked Joseph to tell him what this strange dream meant. Joseph told Pharaoh that this dream was a vision from God. And what the vision meant is that Egypt would have 7 really good years. 7 years where they would get plenty of food from the harvests, when everything would go well for Egypt. But after that 7 years, after those 7 wonderful years, there would be another 7 years of famine. There would be no food. All the crops would get scorched by the sun. It wouldn't be a very nice time at all. Pharaoh was so impressed that Joseph was able to tell him what his dream meant that he released him from prison. And not only that, he made Joseph the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. Aside from Pharaoh, Joseph was the most important person in the whole country. Now Joseph knew that Pharaoh's dreams were going to come true. So throughout those 7 good years, those 7 years where there was lots of food for everyone, Joseph stored up food in Egypt. And when the famine started, all the crops were scorched by the sun. There was no food for anyone and no food for the animals. Joseph's brothers, who were back in Canaan, they were hungry, just like everyone else. They had no food left. But there was plenty of food in Egypt, where Joseph had stored up food for the famine during those 7 years. And so eventually, Joseph's brothers, they packed up their things and they made their way from Canaan all the way to Egypt to ask for some food. They lined up for a long time. There were plenty of people there who wanted some help. And when they got to the front of the line, they bowed down in front of this very important prince of Egypt. And Joseph realized, as he stood there in front of his brothers who were bowing down to him, he realized that his brothers didn't recognize who he was. They didn't recognize him at all. And when Joseph finally told his brothers who he was and that he forgave them for selling him to those merchants, they saw that God was truly with Joseph. You see, God was always with Joseph. He was with Joseph when he was a young boy and he was his father's favorite. He was with Joseph when he got thrown into the pit and when he got sold as a slave to those merchants. He was with Joseph when he got promoted and he was put in charge of that household in Egypt. He was with Joseph when he got thrown back in prison. And he was with Joseph when he gave him the power to interpret Pharaoh's dream, and he became the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. God was always with Joseph. God is with us in good times and in bad times. You know, I think Joseph would have found it really hard to trust God when he was being sold as a slave or when he was thrown in prison for a crime he didn't commit. But God was with him even then. God was faithful to him even then. God uses bad things that happen in our lives for good. Because Joseph trusted God, he knew that God would take care of him. Now, this doesn't mean that nothing bad will ever happen to us, but it does mean that God will take those bad things that happen and use them for good. And eventually, if we trust God, if we have faith in him, we'll be in heaven with him, where no more bad things will ever happen.